Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this weekly episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we will be speaking about the only thing that really anyone's attention's on, the death of Queen Elizabeth II last week, and what that means for the UK, what the new monarch means, and what that means for the new Prime Minister, who's also come into play last week. Uh, it's quite a legacy. Is it sort of 70 plus years in the making? And I heard someone say, the monarch's role is quite an important one, distinctly because it's not about doing lots of things, but it's distinctly what they don't do. And in a way, Queen Elizabeth II, she succeeded in not doing many, many things that perhaps other people in her family failed to restrain themselves on, and that sort of restraint and that sense of dignity and grace is exactly what people remember her for. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that, Brunello, and how you think her time as the longest serving monarch in British history is going to be reflected on.
Yeah, clearly is the argument that everybody is discussing at the moment, one way or the other. Sometimes for its societal implications, other for political or even constitutional implications. This is definitely one of those events that cannot be ignored. That's why we decided to talk about it this week, even if, of course, there was plenty of media coverage about this situation. There were a few things we wanted to highlight, and I'm sure it will come up during this discussion. Clearly, we are talking about one of the greatest figures of the last century. I mean, 70 years in charge is the longest serving monarch in British history. She was in kind of charge for longer than Queen Victoria. She has overseen decades of changes in all possible respects. Think about one of the many ways you can look at the passing of time, the succession of US presidents. So her first president was Truman. Truman was initially vice president of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of World War II. So imagine Truman took his place, and then that was the president when Queen Elizabeth was crowned in 1953. And then, of course, she has seen diverse figures coming along: John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and then Bill Clinton, eventually Barack Obama, the first ever black president in the US. So clearly, everything has changed under her watch, so to speak. Not to mention, of course, what has happened domestically. And if you want, this articulation of the British Empire and its transformation in a Commonwealth, initially from a small group of nations and now a relatively quite large, in fact, group of nations. And that was one of the most peaceful, if I may, dissolutions, again, if I can use this word, of empires in human history. I mean, others have happened much more cruelly. Instead, the dissolution of the British Empire and its transformation in the Commonwealth has happened relatively peacefully. All this comes to the credit of Queen Elizabeth II, I would say.
Right. And it's not, even so much the sort of length of time she spanned, which is in itself extraordinary, but also uh, how restrained she was during that time. And some have contrasted her with the new monarch. And, as is time of Prince of Wales, now King Charles, used to be quite outspoken on certain issues, sort of breaking from royal protocol, particularly on issues of climate change or on government policies you might disagree with. And clearly, that's not the sort of usual protocol for a reigning monarch. And King Charles has said that he's going to, adapt to suit that role. How do you think that sort of changes the relationship between the monarch and between government and politics? And do you think we'll have as still as much of an apolitical royal family with King Charles at the helm?
Well, the role of the monarch is effectively it's been decided during the Glorious Revolution when William of Orange became the king, and the idea at that point was, okay, this is the job description of the Queen. You are the head of state. You are the head of the Church of England, but you shouldn't do anything else. That's it. This is a constitutional country to some extent, in a sense that they have an unwritten set of rules and what you can call constitution
Hmm.
that governs the political life of the country that is led by parliament and the government. The, the king or the queen oversees those activities and should refrain from any political interference. That was the agreement made back in the 16th, at the end of the effectively 17th century. Um, and since then, more or less, this is what all queens and kings have done. Some more so, others like slightly less so. Clearly, when they start going the wrong direction, let's not forget what happened with Edward VIII, that was forced to resign when not just because of the Wally Simpson story. That was kind of the, if you want, the excuse, if I may use this word. The reason was is that he had expressed way too much sympathy for fascism and Nazis, and he couldn't stay in power in a country that clearly was going in the opposite direction. So effectively, once again, it was the prime minister of the time that put the resignation letter in front of the king and said, "Dear king, you may be the king, but you need to resign." So that really tells you how can I
Hmm.
say real power works in this country. So I think this will remain the case. I think Charles will fully understand what his role is now. Clearly, when you are not fully in charge, as he wasn't, uh, he was the Prince of Wales, clearly a very important senior role. I'm not denying that, but still not the king. It took some liberty, if I may,
Hmm.
in terms of expressing opinions and not necessarily political per se. They might be interpreted politically, but it was clearly important kind of world or planet related, if I may, issues such as climate change. I think this will kind of change in coming years. And Charles perfectly knows that these are matters in the hands of parliament and the government, and there's very little room for intervention by the king, which, by the way, has a much more important job to do in his hands, if I may, rather than dictating the political agenda, which is regaining, if I may, all the popularity of his mother, and also making sure that the country stays together.
Right. Definitely some very, very big shoes to fill there. But it's worth kind of recalling how quickly all of this has happened because this time last week, the prime minister was Boris Johnson, the monarch was Queen Elizabeth. Not just the monarch, but the prime minister has also changed. And in quite a turn of events, that sort of might have quite the consequence for things such as the reunification of the Isle of Ireland, which now perhaps might become more likely, certainly because Liz Truss tends to swerve in that direction, and the Queen uh, played a particular role in that stability, which now no longer exists. I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that, sort of going forward.
Sure. So first of all, I would say a few weeks ago, mm, in early summer, we said that the with the potential, of course, we're not calling for it, but foreseeing the possibility with the potential death of the Queen, the reunification of the Isle of Ireland would become more likely, simply because, first of all, they are authorized to have a referendum every 7 years, but and secondly, because Sinn Féin has won on both sides of the now invisible but still existing border between the two sides of the island. Clearly, nobody wanted to promote a referendum that would hurt so much the monarch, such an important and non-serving monarch. But at the death of that monarch, we said, clearly a new political will may emerge of unifying the two sides of the island. Now, that becomes even more likely if Liz Truss goes ahead with the position of revisiting the Northern Ireland Protocol, something that, in my opinion, is highly unadvisable. Also because you don't want to renege a pact that the UK has just signed with the EU, the withdrawal agreement, might reopen such a huge discussion, but also because the agreement was made exactly to prevent the re-establishment of a border between northern and southern part of Ireland. So unfortunately, there is the risk that if you reopen the Northern Ireland Protocol, you open up the Pandora's box of a potential reunification referendum. Speaking of which, Scotland will come to the fore as well, because they've already asked for a referendum to be held in 2023. Now, Nicola Sturgeon will not make the mistakes of the Catalans and go into a sort of formal legal referendum, risking prison and whatever. She will still wait for a constitutional way of doing that. And so the government needs to approve that kind of referendum. Again, maybe Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want to approve that. King Charles might be against that, but as we saw, sometimes political movements are stronger than the will of the individual party, the individual prime minister, or the monarch, du jour, if I may. So at that point, then processes become too big, too powerful to be governed by a single decision. So this is the real job that King Charles III has to do, keeping the country together, making sure that the UK remains, in fact, the kingdom of all the four nations is currently constituted by, rather than becoming simply England and Wales, effectively at the end of the process.
Yeah. And speaking of Wales, it's not just, King Charles that's sort of in the picture, it's also his son, William, who's now been appointed the Prince of Wales, filling his shoes in that role, and effectively making him the right hand to the throne. And that creates a so-called triumvirate that is keen to navigate Britain through these uncertain times. What sort of role do you think that relationship, in particular between son and father, will play?
So many have called for Charles to effectively abdicate almost the day after his ascension to the throne, just to leave his youngest son to become a long-serving monarch, not dissimilar to what his mother has done. That wasn't in the cards, really. I mean, Charles had been waiting his entire life. He has somehow the right of having his chance and showing what kind of king he might be, but he also knows that he starts from, in terms of popularity, a much lower position than the Queen. He has to prove himself. His private life has not been easy, has been on the spotlight for way too long, and clearly he might not be the favorite monarch to begin with, but he can be a good king for sure. He has the potential. Some of the first moves he made has shown empathy. The first one was, of course, reopening somehow the door to Henry, just showing that just because he has decided not to carry senior royal duties, it doesn't mean that he's not necessarily a member of the family. Although the exile in America, sort of exile, auto-imposed exile in America, made things complicated. But it did show an olive branch and say, look, doors are open for you if you want. Other announcements have been made, such as perhaps Charles will not move to Buckingham Palace, he will only keep it for ceremonies and keep it again as a service to the country rather than his own personal residency. So he has the potential of being a good king, perhaps better than others can think. However, he will be faced with formidable challenges, and nobody can
Mm,
kind of deal with all those challenges alone, especially if the level of popularity is not very high. So he asked the help of the heir to the throne, and also because, you know, William is now 40, 41, so he's exactly in the position of start learning the job. So when is his turn, Charles, of course, hopes as late as possible, like everybody else, I would say, he would be fully prepared to become king. I mean, he's been educated to some extent by his grandmother, who was around until he was 40, 41. This is unusual for kings, so could receive an example for very, very long time. Then he's going to receive the example of his father. So
mm,
when he becomes king, he's going to be fully prepared. And so I think it's a very good move by Charles to call his son as his right hand to the throne, and that explains the immediate decision making in Prince of Wales instead of having to wait as he had to do in his case when his mother granted the title just a few years after he was already an adult. So
mm.
I think this is actually a good initial move, I believe, and I would say uh, it needs to get prepared for the challenging times that the UK will face in coming months and years.
Hmm. Certainly a note of sort of cautious optimism. Every characteristic you speak about of any other member of the royal family only sort of makes you realize, again, how, restrained the queen was, and how she managed to not have any major controversies or be in the spotlight for the wrong reasons, for, the best part of more than 70 years. Uh, so certainly quite the week for Britain, especially as the bank holidays announced and the funeral happens the coming Monday, and definitely a moment to recognize that we're all part of the history that's being made here, and will be taught in textbooks. But as always, Brunel, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.